The gunshot echoed across the vast Wyoming Territory plains as Forrest Graves ducked behind a boulder, his breath coming in short gasps. It was 1878, and the unforgiving frontier had just become even less hospitable. Blood trickled from a graze on his arm, but the bounty hunter tracking him wouldn't be satisfied with just winging him. Forrest knew he needed to keep moving if he wanted to see tomorrow. 3 days later, the trail had grown cold for his pursuer, but Forrest remained vigilant. The morning sun crested over the eastern horizon, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold. His horse, a reliable buckskin named Copper, trudged along a little-used path that wound through the foothills toward Colorado territory. Forrest had heard there was work in the mining town of Leadville, and right now, he needed both distance and dollars. Forrest had never intended to become a wanderer. At 32, he'd spent more time in the saddle than most men twice his age. The war between the states had taken his family's Kentucky farm, and the years after had hardened him into the man he was now capable, quiet, and perpetually alone. His tall frame carried the muscle of hard work, and his face, though handsome beneath his neatly trimmed beard, rarely softened into a smile. He guided Copper down a shallow ravine where a thin stream promised water. The horse's ears suddenly pricked forward. Forrest followed the animal's gaze, hand dropping instinctively to his Colt revolver. Through the scrub brush ahead, he spotted movement, not the purposeful stride of a hunter, but something more hesitant. "Hello there," he called cautiously, keeping his hand near his weapon. The brush parted, revealing a young woman no more than 20 by his estimation, clutching the hand of a child who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Their clothes were torn and dirty, their faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. "Please," the woman said, her voice barely audible. "We need help." Forrest studied them carefully. The woman had dark hair pulled back from a face that might have been pretty if not for the fear and fatigue etched across it. The child, a little boy with the same dark hair, peered up at him with eyes too old for his years. "What are you doing out here alone?" Forrest asked, swinging down from his horse. "Running," the woman replied simply. Forrest nodded. He understood running better than most. "I'm Violet," she said after a moment. "Violet Tanner. This is my brother Noah." "Forrest Graves," he replied with a slight tip of his hat. "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere safe," Violet answered, unconsciously tightening her grip on her brother's hand. Forrest glanced around at the empty wilderness. They were at least 3 days' ride from any proper town, and these two looked like they wouldn't last another day without help. "You'll find peace where I ride," he said, the words surprising him as they left his mouth. It wasn't like him to make promises. "I'm headed to Leadville." "Mining town in Colorado. Work there from what I hear." Hope flickered briefly in Violet's eyes. "We don't want to be a burden." Forrest's mouth curved into a rare hint of a smile. "I reckon we can share what I've got until we get there." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of jerky, offering it to the boy. Noah looked to his sister for permission before snatching it eagerly. "Thank you," Violet said, her voice breaking slightly. As Forrest helped them onto Copper, letting Noah sit in the saddle while he and Violet walked alongside, he wondered what kind of trouble they were running from. Everyone in the West had a past, but the way Violet kept glancing over her shoulder told him theirs might still be following them. "We'll stop up ahead," Forrest said, pointing to a cluster of cottonwood trees that promised shade. "Rest through the afternoon heat, then travel by evening when it's cooler. Less chance of being spotted that way." Violet's eyes met his, understanding the implication. "Thank you for not asking." "Folks got a right to their secrets out here," he replied. "I've got my share." That evening, with a small fire crackling before them and the stars spreading overhead, Noah finally fell asleep wrapped in Forrest's spare blanket. Violet sat across from Forrest, the flames illuminating her features in a warm glow. She was prettier than he'd first thought, with delicate features that spoke of an Eastern upbringing. "He's a good boy," Forrest said, nodding toward the sleeping child. "Brave." "He's had to be," Violet replied, her voice soft but clear in the night air. "Our parents died of fever 2 years ago. We were living with our uncle in Nebraska." Forrest waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. "He wasn't a good man," she continued, her gaze fixed on the fire. "When he started looking at me differently, I knew we had to leave. But he found us in the last town, said I'd stolen from him." She looked up at Forrest, her eyes defiant despite the fear lingering there. "I only took what was rightfully ours, my mother's locket, and enough money to get us somewhere safe." "You don't need to explain," Forrest said, adding another stick to the fire. "I want you to know who you're helping," Violet insisted. "We're not thieves or liars." "Never thought you were," Forrest replied. "Get some rest, Miss Tanner. We've got a long ride ahead of us." As days passed, their little party fell into a rhythm. They traveled at dawn and dusk, resting during the hottest part of the day and in the darkest hours of night. Forrest taught Noah how to spot animal tracks and which berries were safe to eat. The boy soaked up the knowledge like parched earth in a rainstorm, and Forrest found himself enjoying the company more than he'd expected. Violet proved to be stronger than her initial appearance suggested. She never complained about the harsh conditions, and when they ran into a small group of travelers heading the opposite direction, she traded her mother's locket for a second blanket and some cornmeal without hesitation. "That locket meant something to you," Forrest observed that night as they ate a simple meal of cornmeal cakes. "Noah means more," she replied simply. "Things are just things." Forrest found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, the way she spoke softly to her brother, how she hummed quietly while gathering firewood, the determined set of her jaw when the trail grew difficult. There was something about Violet Tanner that made him want to be more than the drifter he'd become. On their 6th day together, disaster struck. Noah's excited shout about spotting a rabbit sent Copper startling sideways, and as Forrest rushed to calm the horse, his foot caught in a gopher hole. The snap of bone was audible, and the pain that followed dropped him to the ground with a strangled cry. "Forrest!" Violet was at his side instantly, her hands hovering over his already swelling ankle. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," he managed through clenched teeth. He'd broken bones before and knew the feeling well enough. "Need to splint it. There's some straight branches in my pack." Violet worked quickly, following his instructions to create a makeshift splint while Noah watched with wide, frightened eyes. "Is Mr. Forrest going to die?" the boy whispered to his sister. "No," Forrest answered before Violet could. "Not from a broken ankle, but we're going to need to change our plans." They made camp right there, unable to travel further. Forrest knew they were still at least a week from Leadville, maybe more at the pace they'd now be forced to maintain. He also knew that Violet and Noah couldn't stay with him. They needed food, shelter, and safety sooner rather than later. "There's a homestead," he said as Violet helped him get comfortable against a tree trunk. "About a day's ride southwest of here. Good folks named Peterson. They'll help you get to Leadville." Violet stared at him. "We're not leaving you here." "You have to," Forrest insisted. "I'll be fine. Got food, water, my rifle, but Noah needs proper meals and a roof over his head." "And you need someone to help you," Violet countered. "Your ankle won't heal right if you're dragging yourself around the wilderness." Their argument continued into the evening, neither willing to budge. Noah eventually fell asleep as usual, but Forrest noticed the boy had positioned himself closer to him than to his sister, as if protecting the injured man. "He likes you," Violet said, catching Forrest's observation. He's never taken to anyone so quickly." "He's a good judge of character," Forrest replied with a small smile. "Gets that from his sister, I expect." Violet's returning smile made something in Forrest's chest tighten unexpectedly. "We're staying," she said firmly. "At least until you can ride again." In the end, Forrest couldn't deny the practical truth. He needed their help as much as they had needed his. The next morning, Violet helped him fashion a crutch from a sturdy branch, and they devised a plan to move slowly toward the Peterson homestead together. Progress was painfully slow. What should have been a day's ride stretched into 3 days of difficult travel. Forrest taught Violet how to set simple snares for rabbits, and she proved to be a quick study. Noah appointed himself keeper of the canteen, solemnly making sure Forrest drank regularly as they made their way across the rough terrain. On the third evening, as they camped in the shelter of a small canyon, Forrest noticed Violet staring intently at something in the distance. "What is it?" he asked, reaching instinctively for his rifle. "Riders," she said, her voice tight with fear. "3 of them." Forrest squinted in the direction she was looking. She was right. 3 men on horseback were moving steadily in their direction. "Could be anyone," he said, though his instincts told him otherwise. "Get Noah and hide behind those rocks. I'll deal with them." "You can barely stand," Violet protested. "I can still shoot," Forrest replied grimly. "Go." As Violet hurried Noah to safety, Forrest positioned himself with his back against a large boulder, rifle across his lap and Colt within easy reach. The riders approached slowly, clearly having spotted their camp. "Hello, the camp," called the lead rider as they came within speaking distance. "That's far enough," Forrest responded, his voice carrying across the distance. "State your business." The 3 men stopped their horses, exchanging glances before the lead man spoke again. "Looking for a woman and a boy. My niece and nephew. They've run off and I'm concerned for their safety." Forrest felt his blood run cold. The description was too specific to be coincidence. This must be Violet's uncle. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Forrest replied evenly. "Just me and my injured leg out here." The man nudged his horse forward a few steps. "Funny thing. We've been tracking them for some time. Trail led right this way." "I said that's far enough," Forrest repeated, raising his rifle to emphasize the point. The man held up his hands in a placating gesture, but his eyes were hard and calculating. "No need for that, friend. We're just concerned family looking for our kin." 3 armed men for a woman and child, Forrest questioned. "Seems excessive for a family matter." "Dangerous country," the man replied with a shrug that didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if we water our horses at your stream there? Been a long ride." Forrest knew it was a ploy to get closer and search his camp. Stream's running dry, barely enough for 1 horse, let alone 4. The standoff continued for several tense moments before the lead rider finally nodded. "We'll be on our way then. But if you happen to see a dark-haired woman and a young boy, you might let them know their Uncle Edwin is looking for them. There's a reward for information." Forrest kept his rifle trained on them until they were well out of sight, then let out a long breath. "Violet," he called softly. "They're gone." She emerged from behind the rocks, her face pale. "That was him, my uncle." "I figured as much," Forrest said, lowering his weapon. "They'll be back." He didn't believe me. "What do we do now?" Violet asked, clutching Noah to her side. Forrest considered their options. "We need to move tonight. Different direction than we planned. He'll expect us to keep heading toward populated areas." "But your ankle will have to manage," Forrest cut in. "This isn't about comfort anymore, it's about survival." Under the cover of darkness, they packed up their meager belongings and set out, heading east instead of southwest. Forrest rode Copper, his ankle throbbing with every step the horse took, while Violet and Noah walked alongside. They traveled through the night, stopping only when dawn threatened to reveal their position. For 2 days, they maintained this new pattern, moving by night, hiding by day. Forrest's ankle improved enough that he could put minimal weight on it, which helped when they needed to cross difficult terrain. The constant vigilance wore on all of them, especially Noah, who had grown quieter with each passing day. On the 3rd night, rain began to fall, a blessing and a curse. It would wash away their tracks, but it also made travel miserable and dangerous on the increasingly muddy ground. "We need shelter," Violet said, her clothes soaked through and her teeth chattering. "Noah's getting cold." Forrest scanned the darkness, looking for any feature that might offer protection from the elements. "There," he said finally, pointing to a dark outline against the gray sky. "Looks like an old line shack or trapper's cabin." They approached cautiously, Forrest with his revolver drawn. The cabin was abandoned, as he'd suspected, with half the roof missing and the door hanging from a single hinge. But it was dry enough in one corner, and the walls provided a break from the wind. "It's not much," Forrest apologized as they settled in. "It's perfect," Violet replied, helping Noah out of his wet jacket. "Thank you." They didn't dare light a fire, but Forrest had a small flask of whiskey in his saddlebag, which he offered to Violet. "Just a sip. It'll warm you from the inside." She accepted it gratefully, taking a small swallow before passing it back. "I've never had whiskey before," she admitted, her voice raspy from the burn. "Consider it frontier medicine," Forrest said with a smile. They huddled together for warmth, Noah between them, as the rain continued to beat against what remained of the roof. Despite the discomfort, there was something strangely peaceful about the moment, a pocket of safety in their desperate flight. "You think he'll ever stop looking for us?" Violet asked softly, her head resting against the wall. "Men like that don't usually give up easy," Forrest replied honestly. "But the West is a big place, lots of places to disappear." "Is that what you did? Disappear?" Forrest was silent for a long moment. "Something like that." "War took my family's farm. I didn't have much reason to stay in one place after that." "Don't you get lonely?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Didn't know I was," Forrest admitted, "until I wasn't anymore." Their eyes met in the darkness, and something unspoken passed between them. Forrest looked away first, uncomfortable with the sudden vulnerability. "Get some sleep," he said gruffly. "I'll keep watch." The rain stopped sometime before dawn, and they set out again with the first light, heading northeast now. Forrest had decided they needed to circle back toward civilization, but avoid the direct route to Leadville that Edwin would expect them to take. "There's a place called Fairplay," he explained as they trudged through the mud. "Smaller than Leadville, but still big enough to disappear in. We can rest there, maybe find work, then move on to Leadville when it's safer." Violet nodded, adjusting Noah on Copper's back where the boy had fallen asleep. "How much farther?" "3 days if we're lucky," Forrest replied. "Might be able to catch a stagecoach for the last part if we can reach the main road." Their food supplies were dwindling rapidly, forcing Forrest to hunt, despite the risk of gunshots attracting attention. He managed to shoot a grouse with his revolver at close range, and that night they feasted relatively well for the first time in days. As Noah slept beside the small fire, Violet helped Forrest check his ankle. The swelling had gone down considerably, though it was still tender to the touch. "You're healing well," she observed, her fingers gentle on his skin. "Had worse," Forrest shrugged. "You never talk about yourself," Violet said, sitting back on her heels. "All these days together and I still know almost nothing about you." Forrest poked at the fire with a stick. "Not much to tell." "I don't believe that," Violet persisted. No man learns to survive like you have without a story. Forrest sighed, relenting. I was 16 when the war broke out, fought for the Union, came home to find everything gone, parents dead from typhoid, farm seized for taxes, drifted west after that. Worked cattle drives, did some prospecting, took whatever jobs came along. No wife, family, he shook his head. Never stayed in one place long enough for that kind of life. And now, Violet asked, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Forrest looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the strength and determination that had carried her and Noah this far. Now I'm wondering if I've been running from the wrong things all these years. The next morning brought clear skies and renewed hope. Forrest's ankle allowed him to walk for short distances, giving Copper a rest from carrying him. They made better time than expected, reaching a well-traveled road by midday. "This is good," Forrest said, studying the tracks in the dirt. "Lots of traffic. Stagecoach must come through regularly." They followed the road at a distance, staying within the tree line to avoid being spotted by other travelers who might report their presence to Edwin and his men. By nightfall, they could see smoke from chimneys in the distance, the first sign of civilization they'd encountered in weeks. "That's Fairplay," Forrest confirmed, relief evident in his voice. "We'll go in tomorrow. Find a place to stay, get you both properly fed." Violet's smile was radiant and Noah cheered at the news. Their journey had been long and difficult, but the end was finally in sight. That night, they camped closer to each other than usual, the anticipation of reaching safety creating a sense of celebration despite their exhaustion. Noah fell asleep quickly, but Forrest and Violet sat talking by the fire long after, their voices hushed to avoid waking the boy. "What will you do once we reach Fairplay?" Violet asked. Forrest hesitated. "Haven't thought that far ahead. Fine work, I suppose. Always need men who can handle horses or a gun." "We'll need work too," Violet said. "I can sew, cook a bit. Never been a servant, but I'm willing to learn." "You won't need to be a servant," Forrest said firmly. "A town like Fairplay, they need school teachers, shopkeepers' assistants. Better work for a woman like you." "A woman like me," Violet repeated with a small smile. Forrest felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the fire. "Educated, proper." "I'm not as proper as you think," she replied, her voice softer now. "A proper woman wouldn't be sitting alone by a fire with a man she's known less than a month." "Nothing improper about survival," Forrest countered. "Is that all this is?" Violet asked, her eyes meeting his across the flames. "Just survival." Forrest found himself at a loss for words, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Before he could formulate a response, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond their camp. In an instant, he was on his feet, pistol drawn. "Get down," he whispered urgently to Violet, who immediately moved to cover Noah with her body. 3 shadows emerged from the trees. Edwin and his men had found them. "There you are, Violet," Edwin's voice carried across the clearing, falsely cheerful. "You've led us on quite a chase, girl." Forrest kept his gun trained on the center figure. "Stay back. She doesn't want to go with you." Edwin laughed, a cold sound that carried no humor. "It's not about what she wants. She's my responsibility. Her and the boy both. Responsibility." Violet spat, rising to her feet despite Forrest's warning gesture. "Is that what you call it when you look at your own niece like she's—" She broke off, disgust evident in her voice. Now," Edwin chided, stepping closer. "No need for dramatics. We're family after all." "Family doesn't do what you tried to do," Violet replied, her voice shaking with rage rather than fear. Forrest kept his focus on the 3 men, noting their positions and the weapons they carried. "She's made her choice clear. Leave now and we won't have trouble." "Afraid that's not possible," Edwin said, his pretense of civility dropping away. "The girl stole from me, And you, mister, have interfered in a family matter. My associates here don't take kindly to that." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, the tension thick in the air. Forrest knew he was outnumbered, but he'd faced worse odds before. What concerned him more was keeping Violet and Noah safe during whatever was about to happen. "Last chance," Forrest warned, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Walk away." Edwin's hand moved toward his gun and chaos erupted. Forrest fired first, his shot catching Edwin in the shoulder and spinning the man backward. The other two men drew and fired, forcing Forrest to dive for cover behind a fallen log. "Run!" he shouted to Violet, who grabbed Noah and darted into the trees. Bullets splintered the wood near Forrest's head as he returned fire, dropping one of Edwin's men with a clean shot to the chest. The third man was more cautious, keeping to the shadows as he circled to get a better angle. Forrest's ankle protested as he shifted position, but adrenaline dulled the pain. He spotted movement to his left and fired, hearing a grunt of pain that told him his shot had found its mark. Edwin was back on his feet, though, his right arm hanging useless at his side as he raised his gun with his left. "You're dead, mister," Edwin snarled. "And then I'm going after them." Forrest's gun clicked empty, 6 shots fired, and he had no time to reload. He braced himself for the impact of Edwin's bullet, but instead heard a different sound, the crack of a branch connecting with a skull. Edwin crumpled forward, revealing Violet standing behind him with a thick branch clutched in her hands. "I told you we weren't leaving you," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. Before Forrest could respond, the third man emerged from the darkness, gun aimed at Violet. Forrest lunged forward without thinking, tackling the man just as his weapon discharged. They tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs, fighting for control of the gun. Despite his injured ankle, Forrest managed to get the upper hand, wrenching the weapon away and slamming the butt of it against the man's temple, knocking him unconscious. Breathing heavily, Forrest turned to check on Violet and froze. She stood perfectly still, a look of surprise on her face as a dark stain spread across her side. "Violet," Forrest's voice cracked as he scrambled to his feet. "I think I've been shot," she said, her voice oddly calm before her knees buckled. Forrest caught her before she hit the ground, lowering her gently. "No, no, no," he muttered, pressing his hand against the wound. "Not like this." "Noah," she whispered. "Where's Noah?" "I'm here, Violet," came the boy's tremulous voice as he emerged from his hiding place among the trees. "Stay with her," Forrest ordered, tearing strips from his shirt to make a bandage. "Keep talking to her. Don't let her close her eyes." As Noah knelt beside his sister, chattering nervously about everything and nothing, Forrest worked quickly to bind the wound. The bullet had entered her side and appeared to have exited cleanly, which was something of a blessing, but she was losing blood rapidly. "Fairplay," Forrest said, gathering Violet in his arms despite the protest from his ankle. "We're going now. There'll be a doctor there." He whistled for Copper, who approached cautiously, still nervous from the gunfire. With Noah's help, Forrest managed to secure Violet on the horse, then lifted the boy up behind her. "Hold her steady," he instructed. "I'll lead the way." The next few hours were the longest of Forrest's life. He pushed through the pain in his ankle, leading Copper through the darkness toward the lights of Fairplay. Violet drifted in and out of consciousness, her skin growing paler by the hour. "Stay with me," Forrest urged whenever her eyes fluttered closed. "Just a little further." Dawn was breaking when they finally reached the outskirts of town. Forrest's shouts for a doctor brought people running from their homes and businesses, and soon Violet was being carried into the local physician's house, with Noah clutching Forrest's hand as they followed. "Doctor." Samuel Wilson was a Civil War veteran who'd seen more than his share of gunshot wounds. He set to work immediately, ordering his wife to prepare hot water and bandages while he examined Violet. "Clean through. Missed anything vital from what I can tell," he reported as he worked. "She's young and strong. Good chance if we can stop this bleeding and prevent infection." Forrest and Noah were ushered to a waiting room, where a kindly woman brought them tea and biscuits. Noah fell asleep almost immediately, the exhaustion of their ordeal finally catching up with him. Forrest couldn't rest, pacing despite his throbbing ankle, waiting for news. It was nearly noon when Dr. Wilson emerged, wiping blood from his hands. "She'll live," he said without preamble. "Needs rest, plenty of it, but she'll recover." The relief that flooded through Forrest was so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. "Thank you," he managed. "What do we owe you?" The doctor waved away the question. "We'll sort that out later. My wife tells me you've had quite an adventure getting here." "The law might be interested in hearing about it." Forrest nodded grimly. 3 men back in the woods, 1 dead, 2 probably still unconscious. They were hunting the woman and boy. The doctor raised an eyebrow. "I'll send word to Sheriff Taylor. Meanwhile, you look like you could use some attention yourself." He gestured to Forrest's makeshift splint. "Let's have a look at that ankle while we're waiting for the young lady to wake up." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Sheriff Taylor and his deputies rode out to the scene of the shooting and returned with Edwin and his surviving companion in custody. The story Forrest and Violet told of Edwin's inappropriate behavior and their flight across the wilderness was corroborated by letters found in Edwin's saddlebags, documenting his obsession with his niece in disturbing detail. "He won't be bothering you again," Sheriff Taylor assured them. "Even if he survives the journey to Denver for trial, there's enough evidence to put him away for years." Violet recovered slowly but steadily. The town took a collective interest in the newcomers, with various residents bringing food, clothing, and offers of employment once they were settled. Noah became something of a local celebrity, regaling anyone who would listen with tales of their journey and Forrest's heroism. 2 weeks after their arrival, Forrest sat beside Violet's bed in the small room they'd rented above the general store. His ankle, properly set and bandaged by Dr. Wilson, was healing well, though the doctor warned he might always have a slight limp. "Noah says Mrs. Peterson has offered him a place in her school," Violet said, her color much improved from those first frightening days. "And Mr. Collins wants to know if I'd be interested in working at his dress shop once I'm recovered." "Sounds like you're putting down roots," Forrest observed, trying to keep his tone neutral. Violet studied his face. "What about you?" "Sheriff Taylor mentioned he could use a deputy with your skills." Forrest shrugged. "Never stayed in one place this long before, not sure if I remember how." "You could learn," Violet suggested, her hand finding his on the bed cover. "We could learn together." The touch of her fingers against his sent a warmth through Forrest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "I'm not much good at being settled," he warned. "Never had a reason to try before." "And now?" Violet asked, echoing his own words from nights ago by the fire. Forrest looked at their joined hands, then up at her face no longer gaunt with fear and hunger, but filled with hope and something else he was just beginning to recognize. "Now I'm thinking maybe I found something worth stopping for." The following months brought changes none of them could have imagined during their desperate journey. Forrest accepted the deputy position, his knowledge of tracking and survival proving invaluable to Sheriff Taylor. Violet recovered completely and became an apprentice at Collins' dress shop, where her natural talent for design soon had ladies from as far as Denver commissioning her work. Noah thrived in school, making friends and excelling in his studies. The nightmares that had plagued him during their first weeks in Fairplay gradually faded, replaced by the normal dreams of a boy, his age, adventures, discoveries, and the future. Fairplay embraced them all, as frontier towns often did with those who proved themselves hardworking and honest. By Christmas, no one would have guessed they hadn't been part of the community for years. On Christmas Eve, 6 months after their arrival, Forrest escorted Violet to the town's celebration at the newly built community hall. Noah had gone ahead with friends, leaving the adults to walk together through the snow-covered streets. "I have something for you," Forrest said as they paused beneath the glow of a gas lamp. "It's not much, but—" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. Violet opened it carefully, gasping when she saw what was inside: a gold locket, not unlike the one she'd traded away months ago. "Forrest," she breathed. "It's beautiful." "Open it," he urged. Inside was a tiny drawing of Noah on one side, and on the other, a likeness of Forrest himself, both sketched by the town's photographer who had recently taken up portraiture. "Your family," Forrest explained, suddenly uncertain. "Or at least I hoped. That is, I wanted to ask if you'd consider—" Violet silenced his stumbling words by rising on tiptoe and pressing her lips to his. It was their first kiss, sweet, tender, and full of promise. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. "Whatever you're asking, yes." They were married in the spring, when the wildflowers carpeted the meadows around Fairplay. Noah stood proudly as Forrest's best man, and it seemed the entire town turned out to celebrate the union of the deputy and the dressmaker who had arrived so dramatically in their midst. After the ceremony, as guests danced and feasted under a clear blue sky, Forrest pulled his new wife aside for a moment of privacy. "Happy?" he asked, still sometimes amazed that this life had become his. "More than I ever thought possible," Violet replied, leaning into his embrace. "Who would have guessed that day on the trail when you said we'd find peace where you ride?" "I wasn't sure I believed it myself," Forrest admitted. "Spent too many years thinking peace wasn't meant for men like me." "And now?" Violet asked, her eyes bright with joy. Forrest looked across the celebration to where Noah was teaching some of the younger children a game he'd invented. Then he gazed down at his wife, her dark hair adorned with spring blossoms, her face alight with love. "Now I know home isn't a place," he said softly. "It's wherever we are together." A year later, Violet gave birth to their daughter, Elizabeth Grace Graves, a healthy, strong, lunged baby who had her mother's dark hair and her father's steady gaze. Noah took to being a big brother with natural ease, proudly showing off his sister to anyone who would look. As Fairplay grew, so did the Graves family. Forrest was eventually elected sheriff when Taylor retired, his reputation for fairness and courage making him the natural choice. Violet's dress shop, which she took over when old Mr. Collins moved to Denver, became known throughout Colorado Territory for its quality and style. They never forgot their journey, though. Each year on the anniversary of the day Forrest found them on the trail, the family would ride out to a quiet spot in the hills above town. There, they would share a simple meal and remember how close they had come to losing everything, and how unexpectedly they had found their way home instead. On their 10th anniversary, with Elizabeth now 9 years old and their son James toddling beside them, they made this pilgrimage once again. Noah, 22 and recently returned from studying law in Denver, joined them as always. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd gone a different way that day?" Violet asked as they spread a blanket on the grass. "If we'd never met Forrest?" Noah shook his head. "I don't like to think about it. Everything good in our lives came from that moment." Forrest, his hair now streaked with silver though his frame remained as strong as ever, pulled his wife against his side. I was running too, had been for years without realizing it. From what? Elizabeth asked, always curious about her parents' past. From this, Forrest replied, gesturing to the family gathered around him. From the chance to belong somewhere to someone. Are you glad you stopped running, Papa? James asked, climbing into his father's lap. Forrest looked at the faces surrounding him, his children, his wife, the young man who had been a frightened boy when they first met, and felt the familiar swell of gratitude that had never diminished over the years. More glad than I have words to say, he answered honestly. I thought I was rescuing 2 lost souls that day on the trail. Turns out, they were rescuing me right back. As the sun began to set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley where Fairplay nestled among the pines, the Graves family gathered their things and prepared to head home. The town had grown and prospered, as had they, but some things remained constant: the strength they drew from each other, the peace they had found together, and the love that had begun with a chance encounter on a lonely trail. Forrest helped Violet onto her horse, his hand lingering on hers longer than necessary. After all these years, the sight of her still made his heart quicken, and the smile she gave him in return told him she felt the same. Ready to ride home? He asked, swinging up onto his own mount with only a slight betrayal of his old injury. Lead the way, Sheriff, Violet replied with the smile that had never failed to warm him from the inside. I'm right beside you. As they rode back toward town, with their children chattering happily around them, Forrest reflected on the words he'd spoken so many years ago, words that had proved more prophetic than he could have imagined. You'll find peace where I ride, he had told 2 frightened strangers on the trail. What he hadn't known then was that he would find his peace with them, not just in a place, but in the family they had built together, in the love that had grown from the seeds of compassion and courage planted during those desperate days on the run. The setting sun gilded the world around them in gold, and as Fairplay came into view, with smoke rising from chimneys and lights beginning to twinkle in windows, Forrest Graves knew with absolute certainty that he had found what he had been searching for all along, not at the end of a trail, but in the journey itself, and in the companions who had transformed that journey into a homecoming.